All right, let's talk about the free market. You probably have a story in your head about how it all started, right? Well, I want you to forget that story. Because what we're going to do is dig into the real origin of our modern economy. We're told it's all about freedom, that it just sort of happened naturally. But the truth? It's a story of deliberate design, hidden force, and, yeah, invisible chains.
And this quote right here, from the historian Karl Polanyi, this is basically the key that unlocks the whole thing. The idea that laissez-faire, hands-off economics, was actually planned. It completely flips the script. Free markets didn't just spring up out of the ground. They had to be built. And sometimes that process was pretty brutal.
And this is the central myth we've got to take apart. This idea that if you just, get the government out of the way, markets will just bloom like flowers in a field. It's sold to us as the default setting for humanity. But what if that's just not true? What if history tells a completely different story?
So, what if the free market wasn't something we found, but something that was imposed? What if the state wasn't getting out of the way at all, but was actually clearing the path, sometimes with a bulldozer? Let's look at how it actually went down. You see, for most of human history, life wasn't organized around profit and loss. That's a really new idea. Economies were what we call embedded in society. Your survival wasn't about the best price. It was about your social duties, about tradition, your relationship with your community, and with the land you lived on. So how did we get from that world to our world? Well, it wasn't some gentle, slow evolution. It was more like a construction project, and it had 4 major steps. First, you fence off the common lands that people had used for centuries to survive. Then, you redraw the maps, creating this new thing called private property. Step 3, and this one is so important, you make it a crime to survive the old way, like foraging or grazing animals on that common land. And finally, you use the full power of the state to enforce this new rulebook with contracts and police.
So you see the point here, right? The state wasn't just some neutral referee making sure everyone played nice. No. It was the architect drawing up the blueprints, the surveyor drawing all the new lines on the map, and it was the enforcer making damn sure everybody played by the new rules of a brand new game.
Now, for a market to work, you need stuff to sell. Land, money, but the most important commodity of all, human labor. So the big question for the architects of this new system was, how do you turn self-sufficient people into a workforce? How do you convince them to sell their time for a wage?
Karl Marx, he really nailed the weird paradox at the heart of this new free worker. You're free in a double sense. You're free to go out and sell your ability to work. But you've also been freed from everything else. You're free from any land, from any tools, from any way to make a living on your own. So your only real freedom left is the choice to work for someone else or starve. And this just lays it out perfectly. The story we tell is about voluntary choice, about an open market, but the historical reality, it's a story of dispossession. It's not a choice when the other options have been systematically taken away from you. That's not a negotiation. That's a trap.
And this trap, it was built using legal tools. You look at England and you see the Enclosure Acts kicking people off their land. You look at the colonies and they use things like hut taxes to force people to need cash, which they could only get by working for wages. And then to top it all off, you get Vagrancy Acts, which literally made it a crime to be unemployed. So the overt violence of a sword was replaced by the quieter but just as effective violence of a law book.
But this idea of selling your labor for a wage, where did it even come from? It wasn't invented out of thin air. It actually evolved from a much longer and much darker history of controlling how people work. The methods just got a little sneakier.
Just look at this table. It shows you the whole evolution of control. You go from slavery, which is the total ownership of a person, to serfdom, where you're legally tied to a piece of land, and you end up in our modern system, wage labor, where the control comes from pure economic necessity. And notice the illusion for each one. For us, it's the voluntary contract. See the pattern? The chains become less and less visible, but they never really go away.
And sometimes those invisible chains became very, very visible. Take company towns. Workers would get paid in something called scrip, which was basically fake money that was only good at the one store in town, which of course was owned by the company. It created this perfect closed loop where your wages went straight back to your boss, trapping you in a never-ending cycle of debt. That free wage wasn't freedom. It was just a symbol of your complete dependence.
Okay, so that's the history. But these aren't just spooky stories from the past. Let's talk about how these forms of control are still with us, right now, today.
The software has been updated for sure, but the underlying operating system, it's disturbingly familiar.
The key concept we need to understand is called debt peonage. This is a system where the chains aren't made of iron, they're made of numbers on a ledger. Legally, you're a free person, but in reality, you're trapped by what you owe. You're not working to build a future anymore, you're working to pay off the past.
Now just look at this parallel. It's stunning. After the American Civil War, sharecropping was sold to formerly enslaved people as their path to independence. But the reality was a system of inescapable debt for tools and seed. Fast forward to today. Higher education is sold as the ultimate ticket to freedom and a better life, but for millions, it's a contract for decades of debt bondage. In both cases, the promise of moving up is the bait and a trap of dependency.
The mechanics underneath it all are almost identical. You start with people who don't have capital. You frame a required payment as a free choice. You use the loan agreement as a weapon of control. And here's the most insidious part. Both systems are brilliant at making a systemic problem feel like a personal failure. If you can't get out of debt, well, that must be your fault.
So we come back to this. The whole story of the natural free market, it's not just a cute, inaccurate story. It's an ideology, and it does a job. It makes us forget the force and the laws and the deliberate planning it took to build this thing. It papers over the coercion and makes our participation in it feel like a completely free choice.
And that leaves us with one last big question, a question to really chew on. If the entire economic stage we live on was built by force and the script was written by the powerful, then how free are any of us really to choose the part we play?